At the silent funeral, when everyone believed little Lila was gone forever, a retired service dog named Winter burst in, his fierce gaze locked onto the white coffin. Then, a faint rise in Lila's chest left the family frozen in shock. From that moment, a terrifying secret unraveled, where death was nothing more than a cover for a cruel conspiracy. Don't forget to subscribe to catch our next gripping episodes. The church was heavy with silence, a silence that pressed down on every chest like a stone. The air smelled faintly of lilies, too sweet, almost suffocating their fragrance, mixing with the sharp tang of polished wood and old candles. Rows of mourners sat in hushed sorrow, their faces blurred by tears, their eyes fixed on the small white coffin at the front of the chapel. White too small. It looked more like a toy chest than something built to hold the body of a child. 9 years old, Lila Anderson. Her picture stood beside it, a smiling girl with bright brown eye and hair that always seemed to glow with sunlight. The photograph didn't belong in this place. It screamed of life, of laughter, of running feet across summer lawns. Yet here it was, trying to warm a room that had already gone cold. Hannah Anderson sat in the first pew, her face pale and streaked with grief. She gripped a crumpled tissue in her trembling hand, staring blankly at the coffin, as though her gaze alone could undo what had been done. Beside her sat Michael, his shoulders bowed under a weight he could not carry. His hand rested over hers, but his eyes stayed fixed forward, dry and unblinking. He had cried everything he had to cry. The pastor's voice droned softly from the pulpit, offering words about faith, about peace, about how little Lila was now in a better place. The words fell hollow, bouncing off walls that had already soaked up too much sorrow. No one believed them. Not really. Not today. Somewhere in the back, a woman stifled a sob, the sound breaking through the stillness like glass shattering. Hannah flinched. She felt as though the walls themselves might collapse from the pressure of grief pressing in on everyone. Then it happened. A sharp echoing bark split the air, slicing through the pastor's prayer like a blade. Heads turned in confusion. Murmurs rippled. The heavy doors of the chapel banged open with such force that one nearly slammed back against the wall. And there he was. A large white German shepherd, his coat gleaming like snow under the dim lights, stormed into the room. His nails clicked against the polished floor as he charged forward, eyes blazing with intensity. Winter. Michael's eyes widened in shock. He knew this dog. Everyone did in some way. Winter had once served as a canine, known for his unyielding loyalty and unbreakable focus. He had been retired months ago, but no one knew where he had gone. Now he was here. Chaos erupted in whispers and gasps. The pastor faltered mid-sentence, clutching the pulpit. A man in the second row instinctively stood ready to block the animal's path, but froze when he saw the purpose in Winter's eyes. Winter didn't care about the stares, about the voices, about the hands reaching out as if to stop him. He moved with certainty, his head lowered, ears pinned back, tail stiff like a drawn sword. His growl rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating through the wooden pews as he advanced straight down the aisle. Every step closer twisted Hannah's stomach tighter. She couldn't breathe. Her fingers dug into Michael's hand. She didn't know whether to scream or pray. "Michael," she whispered, her voice shaking. Michael shook his head, stunned into silence. He had never seen Winter like this. The dog's eyes locked on the white coffin. He slowed only when he reached it, his massive body now pressed against the platform where the coffin rested. He lowered his nose to the side of it, inhaling deeply, then whimpered a sound that cut through the heart like a knife. Not a bark, not a warning, a plea. Winter's paw lifted, pressing gently against the wood, scratching once, twice. Then came another whimper, sharper this time, urgent, desperate. The congregation stared in disbelief. Someone muttered, "Get the dog out of here." But no one moved. Winter pawed again, harder claws scraping the paint. His growl deepened, not of anger, but frustration, as if words were trapped inside him. Words he couldn't speak, but had to somehow make them understand. Hannah's chest tightened. She rose from her seat before she realized what she was doing. Hannah, Michael hissed, grabbing her wrist. "What are you?" "Something's wrong," she breathed. Her knees shook as she stepped toward the coffin. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the chapel burning into her, hear the whispers circling like vultures. But all she could see was Winter. All she could hear was his desperate cry. Winter turned his gaze to her eyes, glistening almost human in their intensity. He whined softly, lowering his head, then returned his focus to the coffin. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She stopped in front of the coffin, her hand hovering above it, trembling violently. "No," Michael said from behind her, his voice barely audible, but she ignored him. Winter scratched once more, then let out a low, mournful howl that echoed through the chapel, silencing every whisper, every breath. Hannah gasped. She didn't understand why, but she knew. She just knew. Her fingers brushed the edge of the lid. Cold. Too cold. Her stomach lurched. She closed her eyes for a moment, praying she wasn't about to lose her mind in front of everyone she knew. Then she pushed. The lid creaked, the sound shrill and unnatural in the heavy silence. Gasps filled the room, sharp intakes of breath as the coffin began to open. Michael was on his feet now, his face white as paper. Hannah, he barked, his voice filled with terror, not at the dog, but at what she might see. Her hand slipped under the lid, and with one trembling shove, she lifted it higher. The room seemed to collapse inward, slowing the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her as the coffin's contents revealed themselves. Her daughter, Lila, lay inside, her skin pale as porcelain, her lips parted just slightly. A crown of white flowers framed her small face, their petals brushing against hair that should have been warm alive. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred. Her knees nearly gave out. But then she saw it. The faintest movement. Her chest rose. Barely, but it rose. A whisper of breath escaped Lila's lips, shallow, fragile. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, a cry strangling in her throat. Tears burst forth, blinding her. "Oh my God," she gasped. Winter whined, tail thumping once against the floor as though urging her to see to believe. The crowd erupted in chaos. Shouts, screams, questions tangled together in a frantic storm. Someone cried out for a doctor. The pastor stumbled backward, clutching the cross at his chest, but Hannah didn't hear any of it. She was already reaching in her trembling hands, brushing against her daughter's cold cheek, willing warmth back into it. "Lila. Baby." Lila's lips twitched as if fighting to form words, though none came. Michael staggered forward, his face crumpling with disbelief. He fell to his knees beside the coffin, clutching the edge as though he might collapse if he let go. His eyes filled, spilling over with tears he thought he'd never have again. She's alive," he whispered. Hannah's sob tore through the chapel, raw and desperate, echoing off every wall. She bent over, her tears falling onto her daughter's still body, her hands clutching Lila as though she could hold her there, keep her from slipping away again. Winter stood over them, chest-heaving eyes, never leaving the girl. His body was taut, alert, ready to protect, as though he knew danger still lurked, because this wasn't over. But in that moment, in that shattered chapel, filled with gasps and cries and the sound of a mother's desperate hope, nothing else mattered. The lid stood open. The impossible had happened, and Hannah, her hands shaking uncontrollably, realized with terror and awe that her daughter's story had not ended here. It had only just begun. The chapel had never been so silent. Yet the silence was deafening. It wasn't peace. It was shock, raw and heavy, choking every throat, freezing every breath. All eyes remained locked on the impossible sight inside the coffin. Lila's chest moved, faint, fragile, but real. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs. For a split second, he couldn't process it. He thought his eyes deceived him, that grief had conjured a cruel hallucination. But then it happened again. Her small chest rose, trembled, and fell. She's breathing," Michael whispered, the words breaking apart on his lips. Then louder, with a cry that shattered the stunned stillness, "She's breathing." He lurched forward, scooping Lila into his arms with a desperation that bordered on madness. Her body was cold, frighteningly limp, but alive. He clutched her against his chest, rocking her as though he could transfer his own life force into her. "Oh God, baby, I've got you, I've got you." He choked, his tears soaking her hair. Hannah stumbled closer, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. She pressed her trembling hand against her daughter's cheek, terrified of the coldness she felt there, but clinging to the faint warmth hidden beneath. "Lila, my baby girl." Murmurs erupted across the chapel, a chaotic chorus of disbelief. Someone screamed. Someone else sobbed, but Winter didn't flinch. The great white dog planted himself beside the Andersons, his body rigid, hackles, raised eyes blazing like shards of ice. His growl simmered deep in his chest as strangers pressed forward, curiosity and panic driving them too close. He wouldn't allow it. Winter's stance was clear: protect. Defend. No one touched her unless he allowed it. His gaze flicked from face to face, warning with every sharp gleam, "Do not interfere," Michael shouted through the chaos. His voice breaking, "Call 911. Somebody call now." A man pulled out his phone, fumbling with trembling fingers. Another woman bolted toward the chapel doors. Hannah, still stroking her daughter's face, felt her pulse hammering against her own skin. It was faint. So faint. But it was there. Every fiber of her being screamed at her not to let go. She bent closer, whispering desperately, "Stay with us, baby. Please stay." Then a calm, almost clinical voice cut through the storm. "What's happening here?" The crowd shifted heads, turning toward the aisle. A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His stride was steady, too steady, as if the sight before him hadn't shaken him at all. His silver hair gleamed under the overhead lights, his sharp features set in stone. "Dr. Collins." Hannah's stomach dropped. The same man who had declared with grave certainty that there was no hope. The same man who had looked her in the eyes and told her to prepare for the end. Now he stood there, unblinking, as if the resurrection of her daughter was merely a minor inconvenience. Michael clutched Lila tighter, his chest heaving. "She's alive. She's breathing." His voice cracked raw with both relief and terror. Colin's eyes flickered to the girl, then back to the frantic parents. No smile, no shock, nothing but cool calculation. "Yes," he said evenly, "I see." The words fell like ice. Hannah's skin prickled. She had expected relief or joy, or at the very least astonishment. Instead, Colin sounded detached, almost irritated. "Don't just stand there," Michael snapped. "Help her. She needs help." Collins raised a hand, as if to calm the room. "We need to remain composed. Panic will only make this worse." His voice was steady, too steady, the tone of a man accustomed to control. Winter's growl deepened the moment Collins stepped closer. The dog's lips curled back, teeth flashing white under the chapel lights. The congregation gasped. Someone whispered, "He's going to attack." But Winter didn't lunge. He held his ground, his body angled between Collins and the coffin, eyes fixed on the doctor with a focus that was unmistakably hostile. Collins stopped, tilting his head slightly as though sizing up the animal. "That dog needs to be restrained," he said coldly. Hannah's pulse spiked. She could feel Winter's protective energy vibrating through the air, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was grateful. "Don't you touch him," she warned, her voice sharper than she expected. Colin's gaze slid to her, cool and calculating. For a fraction of a second, she swore she saw something flicker in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Michael was still rocking Lila, panic rising in every breath. "She's alive, Hannah. She's really alive. We have to get her to a hospital." "Yes," Collins said smoothly. "But we must be careful. Moving her without proper evaluation could be dangerous." "Allow me." He extended his hands. Winter snarled. The sound was guttural, primal, vibrating through the chapel floor. Collins froze, his jaw tightening. The dog's eyes burned with a ferocity that needed no words. "Not you. Not now." Hannah's throat tightened. She couldn't shake it, the way Collins had entered without shock, the way his voice lacked humanity, the way Winter reacted as though he had seen a threat no one else could name. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her instincts screamed. She stepped closer to Michael, placing a protective hand on his arm. "We'll wait for the paramedics," she said firmly. Colin's expression remained composed, but the faint crease at the corner of his mouth betrayed irritation. "That may be too late," he replied softly, almost persuasively. "Every second matters." Winter growled again, louder this time, his body coiled like a spring. The tension thickened until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Michael looked between the doctor and the dog, confusion etched on his face. What's happening?" "Why won't he let you near her?" Collins gave a small, cold smile. "Dogs don't always understand what's best." But Hannah's heart hammered with certainty. This wasn't about misunderstanding. Winter understood perfectly. And that terrified her. She met Colin's gaze, her own eyes burning with something sharper than grief, now suspicion. She remembered the sterile hospital room, the quiet way he had delivered the news, the strange shadow that had passed through his expression before he left them alone. She had been too broken to notice then. But now she couldn't ignore it. Winter took a step closer to the coffin, pressing his body firmly against it, his growl never breaking. He was a wall between Collins and the fragile life inside. The pastor stammered nervously from the pulpit. "Perhaps we should all remain calm." But no one was calm, not anymore. The room had shifted, the air electric, the sense that something darker pulsed beneath the surface. Hannah's voice broke through the chaos, soft but steady. "Michael, don't let him touch her." Michael blinked at her, stunned. What are you saying?" Her eyes never left Collins. "I don't trust him." The doctor tilted his head, studying her with unsettling calm. Then, almost as though he had heard enough, he murmured, "Suit yourselves. But if she worsens—" His words trailed off, a shadow of warning lingering in the air. Winter barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound so sudden it made several people flinch. Collins' jaw tightened. He turned slightly, adjusting his suit jacket, his movements smooth and deliberate. "Call your ambulance then," he said coldly. "I hope you are prepared for the consequences." With that, he stepped back, his eyes never leaving Hannah's. There was no warmth in them, only a chilling promise of something she couldn't yet name. Hannah's skin crawled. She wrapped her arms protectively around her daughter, feeling the faint, fragile rise and fall of her chest against her own. And as she held Lila close, Winter pressed against them, his body radiating heat and strength, his eyes locked on the man, retreating down the aisle. Somewhere deep inside, Hannah knew this was only the beginning. And whatever Dr. Collins was hiding, Winter wasn't about to let it stay hidden. The memory came rushing back like a tidal wave. Hannah could neither stop nor escape. One moment she was clutching her daughter's fragile body in the chapel, the next, she was 3 days earlier, inside the auditorium of Westfield Elementary, where the night had begun with nothing but pride and music. The stage lights bathed Lila in a gentle glow. She sat before the grand piano, her small frame dwarfed by its polished body, her hands poised with the quiet confidence of someone far older than her years. The hush of the audience was reverent parents, leaning forward, cameras raised as the first delicate notes of Beethoven drifted through the hall. Michael squeezed Hannah's hand, his smile wide with admiration. "She's incredible," he whispered, his voice swelling with pride. Hannah nodded, her chest swelling with something that felt like pure light. "She's our miracle." The music floated tender and precise, wrapping the crowd in a spell. Every note seemed to carry Lila's soul, each chord more beautiful than the last. She was radiant, her long hair catching the glow, her eyes half closed in concentration. And then the note broke. It was barely perceptible at first, just a falter, a tiny slip of her small fingers. Hannah frowned, tilting her head, thinking perhaps Lila had simply lost her place. But then she saw it, the sudden slackness in her daughter's shoulders, the way her back bowed as though something had stolen her strength. "Michael," Hannah whispered sharply, panic clawing at her throat. Lila's hands slid off the keys. The discordant sound echoed through the hall like a warning bell. Then she collapsed forward, her body striking the keys with a cruel, jarring crash that reverberated across the stunned auditorium. The crowd gasped in unison. A teacher screamed. Hannah was already on her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs, her voice breaking into a cry. "Lila." Michael vaulted over the front row barrier, shoving aside startled parents sprinting to the stage. Hannah followed, stumbling, nearly falling, her eyes locked on her daughter's small form crumpled against the piano. By the time they reached her, the silence had turned suffocating. Lila lay still, her skin pale as porcelain lips tinged blue. Her chest barely moved. No, stay with me, baby. Stay with me," Michael pleaded, his hands trembling as he lifted her gently. "Someone call 911. Hannah screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The world blurred in chaos, teachers rushing, children crying, the principal stammering orders. Hannah felt her knees give way as she clutched at Lila's cold little hand, tears streaming unchecked down her face. The sirens came fast, slicing through the night. Paramedics swarmed the stage, their movements brisk, clinical efficient. Hannah barely heard their words, blood pressure, pulse, weak oxygen, each phrase slicing into her like a knife. Michael refused to let go, even as they urged him back. "Please save her. She's just a little girl." The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and fractured prayers. Hannah held Lila's hand the entire time, whispering, begging, promising anything. Just let her live. Hours later, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the small hospital room. Machines beeped in steady rhythms, wires connected to her daughter's tiny arms. Hannah sat at the bedside, her fingers entwined with Lila's, while Michael paced relentlessly, his eyes red and wild. The door creaked open. Dr. Collins stepped inside, his presence commanding the room immediately. He wore the same calm expression he always carried, as though nothing could rattle him. His suit was immaculate, his hair carefully combed, his every movement precise. He set the chart down, clasping his hands in front of him. Michael spun toward him. "Tell me she's going to be okay." Collins inhaled slowly, his tone grave but measured. "Mr. Anderson? Mrs. Anderson? I'm so sorry." He glanced at Lila, then back at them with eyes devoid of warmth. Her collapse was the result of an advanced neurological failure. "We've done everything possible, but I'm afraid her condition is irreversible." Hannah felt the words crash down like stones, crushing the air from her lungs. "No." Michael's face twisted, disbelief etched in every line. "No, that's impossible. She was healthy. She was just playing the piano." Collins shook his head slowly. "Sometimes these conditions are silent until they reach a critical stage. I know this is devastating, but there is nothing more we can do." "Nothing more?" Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. She stared at him, searching for even a flicker of compassion, a sign that he was fighting for their little girl. but all she found was cold detachment. "I'm sorry," Collins repeated the words flat rehearsed. He placed a hand on the rail of Lila's bed, but the gesture felt wrong, almost staged. "You should prepare yourselves." Michael stumbled back, collapsing into the chair beside the bed, burying his face in his hands. Sobs shook his broad shoulders. Hannah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her entire world was unraveling, the light inside her, extinguishing with every sterile word from Colin's lips. She pressed her forehead against Lila's hand, whispering, "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." It was then she felt the faintest brush of warmth against her arm. She looked up. In the hallway just beyond the glass pane of the door, a shape lingered. White fur glinting under the fluorescent lights. A dog, not just any dog, Winter. He sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the girl lying in the bed. He hadn't been there when they arrived. He wasn't with any officer. Yet now he sat as though he belonged, silent and watchful. Hannah blinked, startled. She had seen service dogs before, had even watched them in action. But there was something different about this one. Something deliberate, purposeful, as though he had chosen to be there. Winter's gaze shifted not to her, not to Michael, but to Collins. Sharp, piercing, relentless. Collins, in the middle of explaining something else, paused briefly. His eyes flicked toward the window, meeting Winter's stare. For a heartbeat, his composure faltered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Hannah saw it. A flicker of unease quickly smoothed over as he adjusted his tie and continued speaking in that same cool, clinical tone. But the dog didn't look away. Hannah's chest tightened. She couldn't explain why, but the image seared itself into her memory. Winter's unblinking eyes fixed like a spotlight on the man who had just told them their daughter's fate was sealed. Her instincts stirred. Something about that gaze told her Winter knew. Not just about Lila. About him. About Collins. That night, as exhaustion forced Hannah into a chair beside Lila's bed, Winter never moved from the hallway. Nurses walked past him uneasily, some whispering about how long he had been sitting there, but no one dared shoo him away. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stayed a sentinel, eyes never leaving the girl. And in the deepest hours of the night, when Michael finally drifted into restless sleep, Hannah glanced toward the door again. Winter's eyes met hers, not cold, not threatening, steady, watchful, protective. It was as if he was telling her wordlessly, "I will not leave her. I will not let him harm her." She didn't understand how. She didn't understand why. But something deep in her soul believed him. And that belief, fragile though it was, kept her from breaking completely. The hospital room was quiet, but not peaceful. Machines hummed with a steady rhythm, their screens blinking in soft mechanical pulses. Michael sat slumped in a chair near the bed. Exhaustion written across his face, his hands still wrapped tightly around his daughter's. Hannah stood at the edge of the bed, adjusting the thin blanket that covered Lila's fragile body. She smoothed the fabric gently, her fingertips brushing across her daughter's arm, and then she froze. There, just above the crease of Lila's elbow, was a small mark. Barely noticeable. A tiny puncture red at the edges, the kind left behind by a needle. Her heart skipped. She stared at it, her chest tightening. This wasn't from the IV. She knew where the IV line had been placed earlier. This was different. Lower, smaller, almost hidden. A tremor moved through her hand as she touched the spot lightly. "Michael." His head jerked up, eyes groggy with fatigue. "What is it?" She swallowed hard, her voice low. "Look." She angled Lila's arm toward him. Michael leaned forward, squinting, his brows furrowed. "Probably just from the IV." "No," Hannah whispered, shaking her head. "The IV's on the other side. This one's fresh. New." He rubbed his temple, clearly torn between fear and denial. "Hannah, we're exhausted. It could be from a blood draw. I was here. No one drew her blood here." She cut in sharply, her whisper trembling. This isn't right." Before Michael could answer, the door opened. Winter, who had been lying silently near the door, leapt to his feet instantly, his ears pricked, body tense. The moment Dr. Collins stepped inside, the dog erupted. A deep, thunderous bark filled the room, sharp and unrelenting. His hackles stood on end, teeth flashing, the sound reverberating against the sterile walls. "Whoa!" Michael shot to his feet, trying to calm him. "Easy, boy, easy." But Winter wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Collins, his barking fierce, guttural, filled with an unmistakable warning. Hannah's pulse spiked. She grabbed the rail of the bed, her eyes darting between the dog and the doctor. Collins didn't flinch. He merely stepped inside, calm as ever, closing the door quietly behind him. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That animal needs to be removed. Now." Winter barked louder, stepping between the bed and Collins, his body a barrier, his tail rigid, his eyes burning with defiance. Michael held up his hands helplessly. I don't know why he's doing this. He's never acted like this before. Collins' gaze slid to Michael, his voice smooth and steady. Stress can affect animals, Mr. Anderson. He senses your fear, your exhaustion. He's reacting irrationally. Winter growled low and dangerous, as if the word irrational were an insult he would not let pass. Hannah's stomach twisted. No. This wasn't irrational. This was instinct. She looked at the doctor, her voice quiet but steady. Maybe he senses something we don't. Collins' eyes flickered to hers. Cold. Measuring. Mrs. Anderson, the last thing your daughter needs is unnecessary drama. If the animal can't be controlled, I'll have security remove it. Winter's bark exploded again, louder than before, shaking the room. Michael ran a hand down his face, clearly torn in two directions. Maybe we should let someone take him outside for a while, just until things calm down. No, Hannah said sharply, surprising even herself. Both men turned toward her. She placed her hand gently on Winter's back, feeling the tense vibration of his muscles beneath her palm. His body quivered with alertness, but the touch seemed to anchor him. He quieted slightly, though a low growl still rumbled in his chest. He stays, Hannah said firmly. He hasn't left her side since the hospital. If he wanted to hurt her, he would have already. He's protecting her. Collins' expression didn't change, but the faint crease at the corner of his mouth betrayed his annoyance. Protection and paranoia are not the same thing. He murmured, his tone edged with condescension. Hannah held his gaze, refusing to blink. Maybe not. But right now I trust him. Something flickered in Collins' eyes, then a shadow quick and sharp. His lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it wasn't kind. It was cold, calculated. Michael shifted nervously. Doctor, please. What happens next? She's breathing again, but she hasn't woken up. What does that mean? Collins turned smoothly, his attention snapping back to Michael. His voice was calm, reassuring, practiced. It means her body is responding. But we must be cautious. There could be complications. The best course of action is to continue monitoring her vitals while we prepare for possible interventions. Panicking won't help. Michael nodded slowly, clinging to every word. Okay. You're right. We'll follow your lead. Hannah's jaw clenched. She could hear the soothing cadence, the steady rhythm designed to comfort. But the words themselves felt empty, evasive. As Collins leaned over to check the monitors, Hannah's eyes drifted back to the small puncture mark on Lila's arm. Her pulse pounded in her ears. He straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. I'll be back shortly with an update, he said. In the meantime, try to rest, both of you. His eyes lingered on Hannah for a fraction too long. The weight of his stare pressed against her chest like a threat wrapped in silk. Winter growled softly, as if confirming what she already felt. The door clicked shut behind Collins. Silence stretched, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Michael sank back into the chair, exhaling shakily. He knows what he's doing, Hannah. We have to trust him. He's the only one who can save her. But Hannah's gaze stayed on the door. Her throat tightened. What if he's the one we need to protect her from? Michael looked at her, stunned. What are you talking about? She touched Lila's arm again, fingers brushing the tiny mark. This. I don't know how it got here. But I know it wasn't supposed to. Michael shook his head, rubbing his temples. We're exhausted. We're seeing things that aren't there. Then why does Winter act like this every time Collins walks in? She shot back, her voice sharp. Winter shifted closer to the bed, resting his head gently on the blanket, his eyes never leaving the door. His body was tense, alert, ready. Hannah looked at him, and for a moment she swore she felt it not just protection, but knowledge. As if the dog could see past the masks, past the lies, into the truth itself. She whispered softly, her hand resting on his fur. You know, don't you? You know what he's hiding? Winter's ears flicked, his gaze steady, unyielding. The unease in her chest grew heavier, pressing against her ribs until it hurt to breathe. She knew then that the real danger wasn't her daughter's fragile body. It was the man who claimed to be saving her. And if she wasn't careful, Collins would make sure no one ever found out what he'd done. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second slicing through the thick tension that blanketed the hospital room. Rain battered against the window like 1,000 small fists, and the storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil raging inside Hannah's chest. She could feel the decision tightening around her like a noose. Michael paced near the door, his hands raking through his hair, muttering half-formed arguments to himself. This is crazy, Hannah. It's insane. We can't just... We have no choice, she cut in her whisper, sharp, urgent. If we stay, she'll die. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow. But she will. You saw that, Mark. You saw how he looked at us. Michael's face twisted with fear, his voice trembling. If we take her, they'll say we kidnapped her. We'll lose everything, Michael. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to meet her eyes. We already lost everything the moment we trusted him. Look at her. Her hand shook as she gestured to the frail figure lying still on the bed. Do you want to sit here and watch her slip away while Collins tells us to be patient? Or do you want to fight for her? Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell rapidly, caught between the terror of staying and the terror of leaving. Winter shifted near the bed, rising to his feet, with a silent grace that spoke of discipline and training. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to Hannah as though urging her forward, urging her to act before it was too late. The storm outside cracked with a deafening boom of thunder. Hannah jumped, her nerves already stretched to the breaking point. Michael finally exhaled, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the world had just been dropped onto them. How? His voice was barely audible. How do we get her out without them seeing? Winter answered before Hannah could. The dog moved to the far corner toward the supply closet, tucked near the adjoining hallway. He nudged the handle with his nose, then glanced back at them, his eyes burning with purpose. Hannah felt a flicker of hope pierce the fear strangling her. He knows a way, she whispered. Michael, he knows. They moved quickly, Hannah gathering the few belongings they could carry. Michael lifting Lila carefully into his arms. She was so light it made Hannah's chest ache. Every step toward the closet felt like walking a tightrope above a pit of flames. Any sound, any misstep, and it would all be over. Winter led the way, his movements precise, silent like a shadow. He pushed the closet door open, revealing a narrow service corridor dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Michael hesitated at the threshold. If they catch us, they won't, Hannah hissed, gripping his arm. Trust him. The hallway smelled of bleach and damp concrete, the air cool and damp against their skin. The storm's howl grew louder, rattling the metal vents overhead as Winter trotted ahead, his body tense, every muscle tuned to danger. They moved as fast as they dared, their footsteps echoing faintly against the tile floor. Hannah's heart pounded, each beat screaming louder than the thunder outside. Halfway down the corridor, a sound stopped them cold. A voice crackled through the hospital's PA system, calm and steady, yet carrying a weight that made Hannah's blood run cold. Attention! The parents of patient Lila Anderson have removed her from medical care without authorization. Security and law enforcement are being notified. Approach with caution. The child is considered endangered. Michael nearly stumbled. Oh my God. Hannah's stomach clenched. Collins. He had moved faster than she feared. Winter growled softly, urging them forward. Go, Hannah whispered fiercely. We can't stop now. They reached a heavy steel door at the end of the hallway. Winter jumped, pawing at the handle until it gave way with a metallic groan. Cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of rain and asphalt. The night swallowed them whole. The parking lot stretched out before them, slick and shining under the dim glow of overhead lights. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking them instantly, plastering Hannah's hair to her face. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Winter bounded ahead, ears sharp, scanning every shadow. Michael clutched Lila tightly against his chest, shielding her with his body as best he could. Hannah stayed close, her eyes darting wildly, searching for movement. The shrill wail of sirens pierced the night. They're already coming, Michael gasped. Winter barked once, sharp and commanding, before darting toward the far edge of the lot. There, beyond the chain-link fence, the dark outline of a wooded trail loomed. This way, Hannah urged. Michael hesitated only a second before following, his feet splashing through puddles, his breath ragged. Behind them, headlights sliced through the storm as security vehicles pulled into the lot. Shouts echoed across the rainmen in uniform, spilling out their flashlights, cutting beams of light across the pavement. There, stop them. Hannah's pulse spiked. Run. They bolted toward the fence. Winter sprinting ahead with astonishing speed for his age. He leapt against the chain link, scrambling up just enough for his jaws to catch the top, pulling himself over in a fluid motion that spoke of his training. Michael stared in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. Hannah shoved at the fence gate, praying it wasn't locked. Miraculously, it gave way with a rusty squeal. They dashed through the shouts behind them, growing louder. Winter led them down the muddy trail, his paws pounding the earth, unbothered by the downpour. Every so often, he glanced back, making sure they followed, then pushed forward with relentless determination. Flashlights flared behind them, bobbing through the darkness, voices calling orders, boots pounding after them. Michael's breath tore from his lungs. We can't keep this up. Yes, we can. Hannah snapped, adrenaline driving her forward. For her, we have to. Winter suddenly veered left, guiding them off the main trail through a thicket of dripping branches. Hannah followed, trusting him completely. Branches clawed at her arms and face rain, blinding her eyes, but she pushed on Michael, stumbling close behind Lila, limp in his arms. The forest thickened around them, the storm muffling the sound of their pursuers. But the threat wasn't gone. It was chasing them, breathing down their necks. Winter stopped abruptly at a shallow ravine. The water rushed below, swollen from the rain. Michael's face paled. "We can't cross that." Winter barked once sharp, then leapt. He landed cleanly on the other side, turned back and barked again, urging them on. Hannah's heart hammered. She grabbed Michael's arm. "We can do this." He shook his head frantically. "If I slip—" "You won't," she said firmly, her voice steel. "Trust me." "Trust him." Michael squeezed his eyes shut, then took a deep breath. Clutching Lila tighter, he leapt. His foot slid on the wet bank, but Hannah's hand shot out, grabbing his arm, steadying him just enough to make it across. They collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping, soaked to the bone. Winter nudged Hannah's shoulder, his body vibrating with urgency. No time to rest. Behind them, the shouts grew louder again. They were still being followed. Hannah pushed herself up, her voice ragged but fierce. "We keep going." As they plunged deeper into the forest, Hannah realized something chilling. This wasn't just Collins anymore. He had the police, hospital, security, maybe even more. This was bigger, darker, a force that didn't want the truth to come out no matter the cost. And now she thought grimly, as Winter's glowing eyes cut through the darkness like twin beacons, they were at war with it. The forest had gone eerily quiet after their desperate flight. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still stalking them from the shadows. Rain dripped steadily from the canopy, each drop like a whisper of warning. Winter padded ahead, his coat slick, his nose lowered as if tracing a trail no human could see. Michael lagged a few steps behind his face, pale, his arms aching as he carried their fragile daughter. Hannah stayed close to him, her eyes darting between the trees, her chest rising and falling too fast. She felt as if the whole world was pressing down on them, trying to squeeze the fight out of her. They reached the back road behind the hospital, a strip of cracked asphalt, almost swallowed by the forest. An old van sat idling under a dying streetlight, its headlights off. Hannah froze, fear stabbing through her. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped out. She was in her mid-30s, soaked in scrubs and a raincoat too thin for the storm. Her face was pale, drawn tight with urgency. Hannah recognized her instantly, Nurse Valerie. She had seen her once or twice during their long nights in the ICU, a quiet presence, often watching but never speaking much. Valerie raised both hands in a hurried gesture. "Don't scream. Don't run. Please. I'm not here to hurt you." Michael shifted his grip on Lila, tightening. "Who the hell are you?" Valerie took a cautious step closer, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. "I work under Dr. Collins. But I can't do it anymore. I can't watch what he's doing." Hannah's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" Valerie reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a manila folder wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain. She held it out with trembling hands. "This. You need to see this. Before he finds you." Hannah hesitated, then snatched the folder, clutching it to her chest as if it were a life raft. The rain pattered against the plastic, the sound harsh and insistent. "Run," Valerie whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "If they know I gave this to you, I'm dead." "You don't understand. This isn't just about Lila. There are more. So many more." "What do you mean?" Hannah demanded. Valerie's eyes glistened with something between terror and guilt. "The children? The ones who never made it home? Collins said it was natural causes, accidents, rare illnesses. But it wasn't. He's part of something much bigger. A drug trial, illegal, dangerous. Lila isn't the first." Michael's face drained of color. "You're lying." Valerie shook her head violently, her voice desperate. "I wish I were. Look inside. Look before it's too late." Before Hannah could press her further, Valerie jerked at the sound of distant sirens and scrambled back into the van. The engine roared to life, the tires spitting water as she sped away, swallowed by the storm. For a moment, Hannah stood frozen. The folder clutched against her chest, the rain soaking through her clothes. Her pulse pounded like a drum. Winter barked sharply, snapping her out of her trance. His eyes were fixed on the hospital looming through the curtain of rain, its windows dark and ominous. He turned back to her, his stare intense, purposeful, like a soldier awaiting orders. Michael's voice broke the silence, tight with panic. "We need to get out of here. Forget the folder. Forget her. We need to go." "No," Hannah whispered. Her fingers tightened on the folder until her knuckles turned white. "Not until I know what's in here." They ducked into the shelter of an abandoned maintenance shed nearby. Hannah knelt on the damp floor, ripping the plastic open with trembling hands. The folder spilled across her lap, photographs, reports, medical charts, and lists of names. The photographs stopped her heart. Smiling children, school portraits, birthday pictures, and then the next page, autopsy reports. Each child labeled with a cause of death, cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, sudden organ failure. But the dates the notes scrawled in the margins, they didn't add up. One file slid free and landed at her knees. She picked it up, her throat closing. The girl in the photo couldn't have been more than 8. Her name was Emma. The report said natural cardiac event. But stapled to the back was a chart of drug dosages marked with initials she recognized: R.C. Richard Collins. Her vision blurred with tears. Oh my God. Michael looked away, his jaw tight, his face pale as ash. Stop! Don't look anymore. But Hannah couldn't stop. The folder was a coffin of truth, every page, another nail hammered into the lid of her trust. More children. Dozens. Names she didn't recognize, each with the same cold signature. Winter whined softly, then turned toward the hospital again. His ears pricked. He padded to the back wall of the shed, sniffing the concrete floor, then scraping at a corner with his paw. Michael frowned. What is he doing? Hannah pushed the files aside and moved closer. Winter dug at a rusted grate set into the floor, his claws screeching against metal. With a sharp tug of his jaw, the grate loosened, revealing a dark tunnel beneath, leading back toward the hospital's underbelly. The smell hit her first, sterile chemicals, mixed with something sour, something wrong. She felt her stomach twist. Michael recoiled. No, absolutely not. Hannah, this is insane. But Hannah's eyes hardened. He's showing us something. We need to see. Michael's voice rose, his panic spilling out. No, we don't. We've got proof right here. He pointed to the folder. This is enough. We take it to the police, the press, someone. We don't go back in there. We barely got out alive. Hannah shook her head, her voice steady, even as her hands trembled. This isn't just about us anymore. It's not just about Lila. If those children... Her words broke, but she forced them out. If they died for this, we can't turn our backs. We need to know the full truth. Winter barked once, sharp and commanding, before leaping into the tunnel without hesitation. His body vanished into the shadows. Hannah swallowed hard, then turned back to Michael. I'm going. He stared at her, his eyes wide, desperate. If you go in there, we might not come back out. Then we don't come out, she said softly, but with steel in her tone. Not until this ends. Michael's shoulders sagged, his expression broken. You're going to get us all killed. Hannah reached out, touching his cheek, her eyes burning. I'd rather die knowing we tried to save her, to save them all, than live pretending we didn't see. Before he could answer, she climbed down into the tunnel. Michael followed, reluctantly clutching Lila close, his breath shuddering. The tunnel reeked of chemicals and damp earth. Their footsteps echoed as they followed Winter's low growls deeper underground. The dim emergency lights glowed faintly along the walls, casting long, shifting shadows. At the end of the corridor, they reached a steel door. Winter pawed at it, then sat back, his eyes fixed on Hannah. She pushed it open. The room beyond froze her blood. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, each filled with binders and files. A table sat in the center, strewn with medical instruments and vials. Against the far wall, photographs pinned up on corkboards. Children. Dozens of them. Their faces stared back at her, innocent eyes frozen in time. Michael turned away, his body shaking. No. God, no. Hannah's hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the sob that tore free. She stepped closer to the board, her eyes scanning the names. She found Emma's, then another, then another. All gone, all silenced. Her knees threatened to give out, but Winter pressed against her leg, grounding her, urging her to stay strong. She turned back to Michael, her tears burning hot against her cheeks. We can't run. Not now. We have to make this public. We have to expose him. Michael's eyes were haunted, filled with fear. You don't understand. If Collins is tied to this, then he's not alone. There are others. People with power. They'll come after us, Hannah. After her. He looked down at Lila, his arms tightening protectively. I can't risk her life again. Hannah's voice shook, but her resolve was iron. If we stay silent, her life and their lives will mean nothing. Winter growled low, his ears pricking, his body tensing. Hannah realized he had sensed someone. They weren't alone anymore. The storm had grown heavier, pounding the ground in a relentless rhythm, as though the earth itself sensed the terror about to unfold. Hannah gripped the folder against her chest, her lungs straining for breath, while Michael carried Lila through the darkness. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. They weren't just running anymore. They were being hunted. Winter was the first to sense it. His ears snapped upright, body tense, head turning sharply toward the tree line. A low growl rumbled from his throat, his body positioned in front of Hannah like a shield. Hannah froze, her heart plummeting. Then she heard it too. Boots, dozens of them crunching on wet earth. Michael's eyes widened as shadows flitted between the trees. "They found us," he whispered, panic slicing through his voice. Before Hannah could respond, a harsh command split the night. "Spread out. Don't let them get away." The voice was deep, commanding, and unmistakably tied to Collins. The men emerged from the darkness, flashlights cutting through sheets of rain. Figures in dark coats, faces half hidden, moving with precision like a well-trained pack. Hannah's stomach twisted. Collins sent them. Michael tightened his hold on Lila, his eyes darting frantically for an escape. "We can't outrun this many." Winter barked sharply, lunging forward with such authority that even the armed men hesitated. His eyes gleamed in the beams of their flashlights, not of fear but of warning, a soldier reborn in the chaos. "Michael, this way," Hannah hissed, pointing toward a narrow trail hidden behind a cluster of oaks. They ran, feet pounding, lungs burning. The shouts grew closer, the lights chasing them like ghosts that refused to die. Branches clawed at Hannah's arms as she pushed forward, her pulse a drum beat of fear. Suddenly a sharp whistle cut through the storm. A gunshot cracked, splintering the night. The bullet tore into a tree trunk inches from Hannah's head, showering her with bark. She stumbled, her scream swallowed by the thunder. Winter launched forward, his body a blur. He crashed into a man lunging from the shadows. Teeth bared his growl, so fierce it froze the others. The attacker fell back with a howl of pain, his weapon clattering to the ground. Winter stood over him, chest heaving, daring anyone else to try. "Go!" Michael shouted, his voice hoarse. "We can't stop." They plunged deeper into the woods, Winter circling back to guard their flank. The storm swallowed the sound of their flight. But the hunters pressed on, relentless. Hannah's mind raced. They couldn't keep running. Not with Lila so weak. Not with Collins controlling the net around them. Finally, Michael stumbled into a small clearing, gasping, his body trembling from the weight of his daughter. He set Lila down gently on the damp grass, kneeling beside her. Her face was pale, almost translucent, in the flashes of lightning, her chest barely rising. We can't keep this up," Michael rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of despair. Hannah knelt beside him, brushing wet strands of hair from Lila's forehead. "We don't have a choice." Michael shook his head violently. "No. Listen to me. Running is going to get her killed. Maybe all of us." Hannah's eyes flashed with fire. "And what do you suggest? Hand her back to Collins? Let them finish what they started?" Michael slammed a fist into the mud, his voice breaking. "I don't know. But this isn't survival. It's suicide." The argument hung heavy in the air, their breaths ragged rain dripping down their faces. Winter paced around them, restless, his eyes never leaving the tree line. He knew the men were closing in. Then a sound so faint they almost missed it, a whisper. "Mom?" Both froze. Hannah's heart stuttered as she turned to Lila. Her daughter's lips trembled, her eyelids fluttering weakly. She leaned closer, clutching Lila's tiny hand. "Baby, I'm here. I'm right here." Lila's lips moved again, the words strained barely a breath against the storm. "Don't let them take me." Tears burned Hannah's eyes as the fragile plea pierced through her soul. She pressed her forehead against her daughter's, sobbing quietly. "I won't. I promise. I'll never let them." Michael's chest heaved as he watched the weight of guilt and fear crushing him. His daughter's voice, so frail, yet so determined, tore through every doubt he had tried to bury. Winter pressed closer, his head nudging Lila gently as though reassuring her with his touch. His body trembled, muscles coiled, ready for the fight to come. In that moment, Hannah realized they weren't just a family running from monsters. They were a family standing on the edge of something far greater. Something that demanded courage, even when fear screamed louder. She turned back to Michael, her voice steady despite the tears streaking her face. "She's telling us what we already know. We can't run anymore. We fight." Michael looked down at Lila, his heart breaking as her tiny chest rose and fell. He wanted to protect her with every fiber of his being. But the thought of confronting the men hunting them made his blood run cold. "They'll kill us," he whispered. "They'll kill her if we don't." Hannah shot back, her voice sharp as lightning. The forest erupted again, shouts closer now. Flashlights slicing through the rain. Winter growled, crouching low, his eyes locked on the encroaching danger. Michael's gaze flicked from his wife's fierce determination to his daughter's fragile face. He closed his eyes, took one shuddering breath, and nodded. Then we fight. The decision settled between them like steel unbreakable. Hannah's tears blended with the rain as she squeezed his hand. Together. Winter barked once, the sound fierce and resolute, as if he understood. The hunters were nearly upon them now, and the Andersons, broken and terrified though they were, rose to meet the storm. The warehouse stood at the edge of town, a skeletal reminder of something long abandoned, its rusted steel beams and shattered windows clawing at the sky like the bones of a fallen giant. The rain had followed them here, dripping from holes in the roof, echoing through the hollow chambers. The place smelled of damp iron and rotting wood. Shadows stretched across the cracked concrete floor, each one threatening to move. Michael carried Lila against his chest, her body limp, but still breathing each breath a fragile thread of life. Hannah moved close behind her fingers, gripping his arm, her own heart hammering hard enough to shake her. Winter padded ahead, every step purposeful, his body tense like a drawn bow. His nose twitched, ears pricked forward, every muscle prepared for the inevitable. "This doesn't feel right," Hannah whispered. Her voice trembled in the cavernous silence, barely more than a breath. Michael scanned the gloom, his jaw tight. "It's shelter," he whispered back. "We need a place to rest, just for a moment." But Winter froze mid-step, his body stiffened, hackles rising. A low, guttural growl rolled out from his chest, echoing through the silence like a warning bell. Then it happened. The metal door at the far end screeched open, the sound of a knife through the still air. Figures surged from the shadows, their boots striking the floor in unison. Flashlights flared, blinding their beams, cutting through the dark like blades. "Get them," a voice barked. Michael spun, clutching Lila tighter, his eyes wild. Hannah gasped, reaching for him. "They found us." Winter leapt forward, a streak of muscle and fury. He crashed into the first man, who lunged from the shadows, his jaws snapping on the attacker's arm. The man screamed, his flashlight clattering to the floor as Winter dragged him down. Blood sprayed across the concrete as Winter held firm, eyes blazing with primal fire. Hannah stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. Another man lunged at her from the side, his hand reaching out to seize her. But before he could touch her, Winter ripped himself free from the first attacker and lunged again, his teeth flashing white in the dim light. He collided with the second man midair, dragging him down in a blur of snarls and fists. Michael shouted, "Hannah, run!" But she couldn't move. She couldn't leave Winter. The chaos erupted further. Shadows circled them, flashlights jerking wildly, shouts bouncing off the steel walls. The men were trained, but they hadn't expected a soldier disguised as a dog. Then the voice came, calm, cold. "Enough!" The words sliced through the air, silencing the room like the crack of a whip. Collins stepped into the light. His dark coat clung to his tall frame, his hair slick from the rain, his eyes sharp and unfeeling. In the flicker of the flashlights, his face was carved from stone, handsome, clinical, utterly devoid of compassion. Winter froze mid-growl. His teeth bared, his body coiled to strike again. But his eyes locked on Collins, recognizing the true threat. Hannah's breath caught in her chest. "You..." Collins tilted his head, studying her, as though she were a specimen under glass. Then his gaze shifted to Lila, limp in Michael's arms. His lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "I should thank you," he said smoothly, his voice echoing against the steel beams. "You saved me the trouble of transport." Michael's arms tightened protectively around his daughter. "Stay away from her." Collins ignored the warning. His eyes never left Lila. "She's stronger than the others. The drug works differently in her. If I can finish my work, if I can control it, she could become the key." Hannah's stomach turned to ice. "She's a child!" She spat, her voice shaking with fury. "Not some experiment." Collins met her glare with a detached calm. "Children adapt faster. Their systems are malleable. You wouldn't understand. She's my daughter," Hannah cried. "And you tried to bury her alive." Collins's eyes flickered just for a moment, as though her words had pricked something deep inside. But it was gone in an instant. He stepped closer, his hand sliding inside his coat. Michael shifted, blocking Lila with his body. His voice trembled with rage. "You'll never touch her again." Collins's lips curved in a thin smile. "You think you have a choice?" He withdrew a pistol, the metal glinting under the flickering light. The barrel rose slowly, deliberately, pointing straight at Michael. Hannah's body surged forward on instinct, her scream ripping through the air. "No!" Before Collins could pull the trigger, Winter launched himself like a bullet. His body struck Collins with bone-shattering force, the gunshot exploding into the air, the sound ricocheting through the hollow warehouse. The bullet whizzed past Michael's head, embedding itself in the steel beam behind him with a vicious clang. Collins stumbled back, the pistol knocked from his grip. Winter snarled, his teeth inches from Collins's throat, his weight pinning the man to the ground. Collins's eyes widened for the first time, the mask of calm cracking into something raw, fear. Hannah's chest heaved, her pulse a storm in her veins. She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside Michael and Lila. She clutched her daughter's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're not giving her to you," she whispered, her voice breaking but fierce. "We'll never give her to you." Michael's arms shook as he held Lila tighter, his own tears mingling with the rain dripping from the ceiling. He looked at Hannah, his voice barely audible over Winter's growls. "He's not going to stop." Hannah's eyes burned with a fire she didn't know she had. "Then neither are we." Winter's growls deepened, his jaws pressing closer to Collins's throat. The doctor froze beneath him, his breath shallow, his hand twitching toward the fallen pistol. But Winter's eyes locked with Hannah's for the briefest second. He wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier, a protector, a guardian forged from loyalty and love. And in that instant, Hannah knew he would give everything to keep them safe. Collins moved his hand an inch closer to the gun. Winter's body tensed like a drawn bow ready to strike. The storm outside howled louder, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then Collins's fingers brushed the steel. Winter launched. The scene exploded into chaos. Rain still drummed against the cracked roof, but inside the warehouse, silence weighed heavier than the storm. The air smelled of gunpowder and damp steel. Winter's chest heaved, his jaws hovering over Collins's throat. The doctor frozen beneath him, like prey pinned under a predator. Hannah's pulse thundered in her ears. Michael still clutched Lila, his arms trembling, her fragile breaths keeping him grounded to the world. Then, from the far corner, footsteps echoed steady, deliberate. Not the frantic rush of Collins's men, not the shuffling of terrified survivors. These were different, calm, measured, the kind of steps that belonged to someone who wasn't afraid to walk into hell. "Easy, boy." The voice was low, gravelly, touched by years of wear and smoke. Winter's ears twitched, and for the first time since the ambush, his growl faltered. His head turned slightly, golden eyes catching a figure stepping from the shadows. An older man, mid-60s, perhaps tall, but weathered with a face carved from decades of battles he didn't always win. His hair was silver, his jaw rough with stubble, his eyes sharp and steady as they locked on Winter. He wore a long coat, rain dripping from the brim of his worn-out hat. Winter's body shifted not away, but in recognition. His tail twitched, his eyes softening just enough to break the tension. Hannah stared breathless. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked briefly to her, then back to Winter. A small smile touched his lips, faint and bittersweet. "Name's Jack Sullivan. Used to wear a badge. Back when it meant something." Collins's eyes widened, fear flickering into rage. "You!" His voice was a hiss, venomous. "You should have stayed gone." Jack didn't look at him. He crouched slightly, holding out a hand toward Winter. "Easy, soldier. You did good, real good." Winter hesitated, then stepped back just enough to let Collins breathe. But his body stayed tense, his teeth still bared, as though promising that one wrong move would mean the end. Michael's voice cracked, desperate. "Why are you here?" Jack's gaze shifted to the girl in Michael's arms. His face softened, though his eyes stayed haunted. "Because this ain't the first time Collins tried something like this. And because that dog..." He nodded toward Winter, pride hidden beneath the gravel of his voice. "Was mine before he was yours." Hannah's lips parted in shock. "You trained him." Jack nodded once. Every command, every instinct. Winter saved lives in the field. He was more than a partner, he was family. His eyes glinted with something sharp, something old. And years ago, we stumbled onto a case. Just like this one. Collins spat blood onto the floor, his lips curling. "That case was buried." "You were buried?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Yeah, you thought wrong." He reached into his coat slowly, carefully. Winter's eyes tracking every move, and pulled out a battered leather folder. The edges were frayed, the cover scuffed, but the weight of it seemed heavier than iron. Jack crossed the distance, his boots echoing against the concrete, and handed it directly to Hannah. Her fingers shook as she took it, the leather cold against her palms. She flipped it open and froze. Inside were photographs. Children. Names typed neatly under their faces. Files marked with red stamps, missing. Pages filled with medical jargon, drug dosages, failed trials, and clinical notes signed by none other than Dr. Jonathan Collins. Her breath caught. "Oh my God." Jack's voice was grim, steady. "Those kids never came back. Their parents buried empty coffins. Michael's throat worked as he tried to swallow, his voice barely audible. He's been doing this for years. Jack nodded, and paying off the right people to keep it quiet. He reached into his coat again, pulling out a USB drive sealed in a plastic bag. Emails, bank transfers, recorded calls, enough to burn him down and take half his friends with him. Collins's face twisted, panic finally cracking through the mask. You don't know what you're playing with. This is bigger than you think. Jack crouched in front of him, his eyes hard as steel. I know exactly what I'm playing with, and I'm done letting kids pay the price. Hannah clutched the folder, her tears blurring the photographs of strangers who could have been her daughter. She felt the weight of every child Collins had stolen, every family he had broken. Her chest burned with rage, with grief, with something that sharpened into resolve. No more running, she whispered. Michael looked at her, fear still in his eyes. Hannah. She met his gaze, her voice firm, almost unrecognizable. We can't just disappear. If we run, he wins again. We end this. Here. Now. Michael's arms tightened protectively around Lila. His whole body shook, torn between terror and the fire in Hannah's eyes. Finally, his jaw clenched. He nodded. Jack's lips curved in approval, faint but certain. That's the spirit. Collins laughed suddenly, the sound sharp and hollow. You think anyone will believe you? You're nothing. Just grieving parents clutching lies. I own the system. The cops, the judges, the papers, they all answer to me. Hannah stepped closer, her hands gripping the folder like a weapon. Not anymore. Winter growled low, his body pressing protectively against Hannah's leg, as though sensing her resolve. Jack rose slowly, his voice steady but fierce. You wanted control, Collins. You wanted to play God. But you forgot something. Truth has teeth. And tonight it's hungry. The storm outside roared, louder wind rattling the broken windows, as if the world itself was ready for the reckoning. Michael kissed Lila's damp hair, whispering a promise only she could hear. Hannah clutched the folder, her knuckles white. Jack adjusted his coat, his hand brushing the worn badge still clipped inside, an old habit, a memory of a man who once believed the law meant justice. The fear that had stalked them for days was still there, but it no longer ruled them. It burned into something sharper. Determination. The Andersons weren't prey anymore. They were ready to fight, and with Winter at their side, they would not lose. The hospital had never felt this quiet, not even at night. The sterile white hallways, usually humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and distant beeps of monitors, seemed to hold their breath. Shadows stretched long and thin across the tiled floor as the storm outside rattled the windows. Hannah gripped the worn leather folder against her chest, the one Jack had given her, its edges digging into her palms. She could feel the truth inside it, burning like a live coal demanding to be used. But Jack had warned them evidence wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed proof so undeniable that not even Collins's money and influence could smother it. Winter padded silently beside her muscles, tense ears twitching at every creak and distant sound. He was no longer just a protector. He was a compass. Somehow the dog seemed to know where the answers were buried. Michael followed close behind his arm, steadying Lila against his chest. She looked pale, her breath shallow, but her small hand still clutched a corner of her father's shirt. Every rise and fall of her chest was both a blessing and a knife in his heart. They reached the lower level, a wing of the hospital that had been sealed off for renovations, or at least that's what the sign said. The paint on the walls was peeling and the fluorescent lights above flickered like dying stars. Jack said the files are in the archive room, Hannah whispered, glancing at the map on the wall. Her voice trembled, but determination underpinned every word. Michael shifted Lila carefully. If Collins catches us here, he won't. Hannah cut in her eyes, flicking to Winter. Not with him. Winter's nose twitched, head lowering as he sniffed the air. Then suddenly, his body stiffened. He growled low and sharp, staring at a corner where the ceiling met the wall. Hannah followed his gaze and froze. A tiny red light blinked. A camera. Hidden almost invisible in the shadows. Hannah's heart lurched. We're being watched. Michael's grip tightened on Lila. Then it's too late. But before panic could take root, Winter moved. In a flash, he leapt onto a metal cart pushed off the wall and clamped his teeth around the camera. Wires snapped, sparks crackled, and the feed went dark. He landed gracefully, his chest rising and falling with fierce determination. Michael stared wide-eyed. He knew. Hannah's throat tightened. He always knows. They hurried down the corridor, Winter leading the way, like a soldier on a mission. The archive room was just ahead, its steel door locked with a keypad. Hannah's hands trembled as she typed in the code Jack had given them. For one terrifying moment, she thought it wouldn't work. Then the lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was lined with metal filing cabinets, shelves, stacked with boxes, and rows of binders so thick they looked like they could hold the weight of lives. The air smelled of dust and chemicals, a mixture that stung the nose and throat. Winter darted in, sniffing the ground, circling the room with precision. He stopped suddenly at a cabinet near the far wall, pawing at the bottom drawer. Hannah rushed over, yanking it open. Inside were folders marked with dates, medical terms, and photographs. Some of the faces looked hauntingly familiar from the folder Jack had given them. Children. So many children. Her stomach churned. Michael looked away, pressing his lips to Lila's hair, as though shielding her from the ghosts that stared up at them from those pages. Then came the sound that turned their blood cold. Footsteps. Dozens of them. Heavy. Approaching fast. Winter's ears snapped forward, his body bristling. He growled deep and menacing, positioning himself between the door and the family. Hannah's heart pounded as the handle rattled. She shoved the folder into her bag, her voice a frantic whisper. "We have to get out of here." The door burst open. Collins's men poured in, their faces hard, their eyes devoid of mercy. Some carried batons, others guns. Collins himself was not there, but his shadow hung over the room through these men like a curse. Winter lunged before the first man could raise his weapon. His jaws clamped onto the attacker's arm, dragging him down with a furious snarl. The man screamed, the sound sharp and raw. "Go!" Michael shouted, clutching Lila tighter as Hannah grabbed his free hand. The corridor exploded into chaos. Winter darted, attacked, retreated, every move calculated, every strike meant to buy them seconds. But the men kept coming. Michael's breath came ragged. He ducked behind a corner, pressing Lila against the wall. "We can't keep this up." Hannah's eyes burned with fury. "We don't have a choice." Winter knocked another man to the ground, then spun back to guard them, his chest heaving. Amid the chaos, a weak voice whispered, "Mom?" Hannah's head snapped down. Lila's eyes had fluttered open. Her lips moved slowly, painfully. "Don't stop." Tears filled Hannah's eyes. She cupped her daughter's face, her voice breaking. "I won't, baby. I promise. I won't." The words struck her like lightning, electrifying her resolve. She wasn't just fighting to expose Collins now. She was fighting because her daughter, against all odds, still believed in her. Michael looked at Winter, who stood watch, his golden eyes fierce in the dim light. He lowered his voice, as if speaking to a fellow soldier. "You know what's at stake, don't you?" Winter tilted his head slightly, ears twitching as though listening. Michael's throat tightened. "I don't know if we'll make it out of this, but I trust you more than anyone." His eyes glistened as he swallowed hard. "Keep them safe, please." Winter's chest rumbled with a growl, not one of threat, but of promise. He stepped forward, pressing his body against Michael's leg, for the briefest moment like an oath. Then he turned, eyes narrowing at the corridor, ready for the next wave. The footsteps grew louder again. They were surrounded, but this time there was no hesitation. Hannah clutched the evidence to her chest. Michael held Lila close, his body a shield. And Winter stood in front, muscles coiled, teeth bared, ready to tear through the darkness. The hunt for truth had begun. And nothing, not Collins, not his men, not the shadow of fear, was going to stop them. The storm had turned the city into a place of shadows and jagged light. Rain hammered the streets, washing away the traces of footsteps, and the wind howled like a warning. Hannah's heart was a drumbeat in her chest, every thud echoing the panic tearing through her body. Lila was gone. One moment she had been clutching her mother's hand, fragile but alive, and the next, a flash of headlights, the screech of tires, the rough hands that tore her away. Collins had her. Hannah could still hear his voice over the rain, low and venomous, as he leaned from the black SUV, before disappearing into the night. "The files, Hannah. Bring them, or you'll never see her alive again." She clutched the folder tight against her chest, now the pages, inside damp with rain, seeping through the seams of her coat. Evidence. Proof. The only thing keeping Collins's empire from swallowing them whole. Michael stood at her side, his face carved from fear and fury, eyes scanning the storm-darkened streets. And ahead of them, Winter, drenched to the bone, fur plastered against taut muscle, his eyes burning with something primal. He knew. He understood. Where Michael shouted over the roar of the rain, Winter lowered his head, nose pressed to the wet pavement. He sniffed, then darted forward without hesitation, weaving through the maze of alleys like he was chasing a scent burned into his soul. Hannah and Michael followed their shoes, splashing through puddles, lungs straining against the cold air. Hannah clung to the folder, her mind replaying Lila's faint whisper from earlier. Don't stop. Her baby had trusted her. She couldn't fail now. Ahead, the glint of headlights sliced through the rain. The black SUV skidded around a corner, tires hissing against the slick asphalt. Through the rain-streaked windows, Hannah caught a flash of Lila's pale face. Her small hand pressed weakly against the glass. Hannah's scream ripped through the storm. The SUV accelerated. Winter bolted after it, his paws pounding the pavement like thunder. His breath came in sharp bursts, his body moving with lethal precision. Michael grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her forward. "Go! We can't lose him." They ran, but the car was faster. Winter, however, was relentless. He surged ahead, weaving through the streetlights, the rain blurring his form into something almost otherworldly. He leapt, landing on the hood with a snarl that pierced the storm. The SUV swerved violently, horns blaring as nearby cars skidded to avoid the chaos. Inside the vehicle, Collins's face twisted in shock and rage. He tried to shake Winter off, jerking the wheel. But the dog dug his claws into the metal, his teeth snapping inches from the glass. "Hold on," Michael shouted, dragging Hannah behind a row of parked cars as the SUV careened dangerously close. With a deafening crash, Winter launched himself toward the side window, his body slamming against it with explosive force. Glass shattered, spraying into the night. Lila screamed as Winter forced his way through his powerful jaws, snapping at the arm that held her captive. Collins cursed, pulling a gun from his coat. Hannah's breath froze. No, Michael didn't think he moved. He sprinted into the chaos, slamming his shoulder into the SUV's door, ripping it open. Winter had already clamped down on the attacker's arm, yanking him backward with brutal strength. Blood mixed with rain washing down the side of the vehicle. "Grab her," Michael roared. Hannah lunged forward, pulling Lila into her arms. She felt the faint warmth of her daughter's breath against her neck and sobbed in relief. "I've got you, baby. I've got you." But the victory was short-lived. Collins emerged from the driver's seat, his face twisted into a mask of fury. Rain streamed down his sharp features as he raised the gun, his voice a growl drowned by thunder. "You think you can stop me?" he spat. "Do you know who I am? This city bends for me, and you." He leveled the gun at Michael's chest. "You're already dead." Time slowed. Hannah's scream caught in her throat. Michael stepped forward, his body a shield even as Lila whimpered against her mother's shoulder. Then Winter moved. With a speed born from instinct and desperation, the dog launched himself at Collins, knocking his arm upward just as the gun went off. The shot exploded into the night, the bullet tearing through the rain, harmless this time. Collins stumbled backward, fighting to regain control, but Winter's teeth sank deep into his arm, wrenching the gun free. Michael dove, tackling Collins to the ground. The two men wrestled in the mud fists, striking grunts and curses mixing with the storm. Collins was strong, fueled by rage and desperation. But Michael was fighting for more than survival. He was fighting for his family. Hannah clutched Lila tightly, her tears mixing with the rain as she watched the battle unfold. She wanted to help, but her body was trembling, frozen between terror and the need to protect her child. Winter didn't hesitate. He circled, snarling, waiting for the moment Collins tried to gain the upper hand again. Collins slammed Michael's head into the ground, his fingers clawing toward the fallen gun. Hannah's heart seized. "No!" She bolted forward, kicking the weapon away, just as Collins's hand closed on it. Her voice broke fierce and desperate. "You're not taking her again," Collins roared, shoving Michael aside and lunging for Hannah. But before he could touch her, Winter hit him full force, teeth flashing, dragging him backward into the mud. Collins screamed, thrashing, but Winter's grip was merciless. Sirens pierced the storm. Red and blue lights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the rain-slick pavement. Police vehicles screeched to a halt, doors flying open as armed officers poured out. "Freeze!" one shouted. Collins's face twisted in panic. He tried to rise, but Michael pinned him down, fists clenched tight around his coat. Winter stood over them both, growling, daring him to move. Hannah stumbled backward, clutching Lila, her body trembling with shock and relief. The officers swarmed in, pulling Collins away, slapping handcuffs around his wrists as he spat curses into the rain. "You'll regret this," he screamed, his voice breaking. "You'll all regret this." But his words were drowned by the sound of Winter's low growl and the steady sobs of a mother holding her child. Hannah collapsed to her knees, pressing her lips to Lila's damp hair. "You're safe now," she whispered, though her voice cracked under the weight of it. "You're safe." Michael dropped beside them, his chest heaving, his hands shaking as he pulled them both close. Winter sat beside them, his eyes still locked on Collins as the man was dragged away. But when Hannah's hand found his damp fur, he leaned into her touch. For the first time in days, Hannah allowed herself to believe it. Collins was finished. But as the storm raged on above them, she knew this was only the beginning. The night still smelled of rain and smoke, when the flashing red and blue lights painted the horizon. Collins was shoved into the back of a squad car, his wrists bound tight in steel, his mouth spilling threats no one cared to hear anymore. His empire had collapsed in a single violent storm. For the first time in weeks, Hannah felt like the air she was breathing wasn't poison, but her chest still ached with fear. She stood frozen, holding Lila tightly against her, as paramedics swarmed in with stretchers and flashing equipment. Michael guided them toward the ambulance, his hand on Hannah's shoulder, his own body trembling from the fight. Winter trotted alongside, fur-soaked eyes never leaving Lila's pale face. He stayed close enough that Hannah could feel the heat radiating from his body as if he were anchoring her to reality. Inside the ambulance, the air smelled sharp, sterile medical, edged with the tang of blood and rain. Hannah laid Lila gently on the stretcher, brushing wet strands of hair from her daughter's clammy forehead. "You're safe now, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "You're safe." Lila's chest rose and fell shallowly. Her eyelids fluttered, but never opened fully. The paramedic checked vitals quickly, calling numbers Hannah couldn't focus on. "She's stable for now," he muttered, strapping an oxygen mask over her tiny face. "We need to get her to County General fast." Michael's hand found Hannah's gripping tightly, grounding her. His knuckles were scraped raw, blood streaked with rain, but his voice held steady. "She's going to make it." Hannah wanted to believe him. Winter jumped into the ambulance uninvited, settling beside Lila. One of the paramedics started to protest, but the look in Hannah's eyes silenced him. Winter wasn't leaving, not now, not ever. The sirens wailed and the city blurred past as the ambulance surged forward. Hannah bent low, pressing her forehead against her daughter's tiny hand, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. By the time they reached the hospital, the media had already descended. Cameras flashed through the rain reporters, shouting questions as Hannah and Michael shielded Lila's stretcher with their bodies. Police held the crowd back, their radios crackling with the news Collins's crimes had been exposed. The evidence those files Hannah clutched to her chest hours ago was now in safe hands. Pages filled with names, photographs, medical charts. Children who had vanished without explanation. Parents who had begged for answers. For them, tonight marked the first step toward the truth. Inside the hospital, under harsh fluorescent lights, the air turned heavy again. Hannah and Michael stood outside the emergency room, holding each other like lifelines, as doctors worked behind closed doors. Winter sat at their feet, still dripping, his gaze locked on the door, as if his eyes could will it to open. Minutes stretched into hours. Hannah couldn't sit. She paced the sterile hallway, arms wrapped around herself, ears straining for any sound from inside. Michael stayed still, his elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He was a man who had always believed in control, but tonight he looked as fragile as glass. Finally, the door swung open. Dr. Patel, her face solemn, stepped into the hall. Hannah nearly collapsed into her. "She's stable," the doctor said softly. Relief flooded Hannah, but before she could exhale, the words continued, each one heavier than the last. "But there are complications. The toxins in her system, the ones introduced during Collins's experiments, they've disrupted neural pathways. We've managed to stabilize her physically, but..." She hesitated. "There's a strong possibility she'll suffer permanent memory loss." The words shattered something inside Hannah. Her knees buckled and Michael caught her just in time. "No." Hannah's voice cracked barely more than a whisper. "She's only 9. She can't..." Dr. Patel laid a gentle hand on her arm. "She's alive. And that's more than we expected tonight. The rest we'll face together." Tears burned hot in Hannah's eyes. She clutched Michael's shirt, her sobs breaking loose after days of holding everything in. "She won't remember me," she cried. "She won't remember us." Michael wrapped his arms around her tightly, pressing his cheek to her hair. "Then we'll make new memories," he whispered fiercely. "We'll give her everything we can all over again." Winter nudged Hannah's knee with his wet nose, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in his fur, the warmth of him a balm against the icy ache in her chest. When they were finally allowed into Lila's room, the sight broke Hannah's heart. Her little girl lay motionless under crisp white sheets, an IV line threading into her small arm. The beep of the monitor was steady, a fragile rhythm that felt like a lifeline. Hannah sat beside her, taking her hand gently. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "It's Mommy. We're right here." Lila's eyelids fluttered, but her gaze was unfocused, her lips moving faintly beneath the oxygen mask. Hannah leaned closer, straining to hear. A faint murmur escaped, broken and fragile, cold. So cold. Hannah's tears spilled freely. She pressed kisses to her daughter's knuckles. I've got you. We'll keep you warm. Michael brushed Lila's damp hair back gently. His own eyes rimmed red. We're not going anywhere, Lila. You're safe now. Winter settled at the foot of the bed. His body curled protectively against the rails. His eyes never left Lila's small frame, the soft rumble of his breath filling the silence like a vow. Outside the hospital room, the world was changing. News outlets broadcast Collins' arrest, exposing the underground network of illegal medical experiments he'd orchestrated for years. Parents flooded the hospital lobby, some clutching photos of their missing children, others crying as they recognized the faces from the files. Hope long buried was finally being resurrected. Inside, Hannah felt torn between that hope and the grief of what her daughter might never regain. She turned to Michael, her voice breaking. What if she never remembers us? Michael's hand tightened around hers. Then we'll remind her every day who we are, who she is. Love doesn't vanish just because memory does. Hannah looked at him, at the raw determination in his eyes. And for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the faint flicker of belief. Maybe love could outlast even memory. Winters shifted closer, laying his head gently on the edge of the bed, eyes soft and unyielding. Hannah stroked his damp fur, whispering through her tears. You saved her. You saved us. In that moment, surrounded by the weight of pain and the fragile glow of hope, the room felt transformed. Not healed, not yet, but illuminated by the possibility that healing was still to come. And Hannah knew one thing with certainty: they would face whatever came next together. Under the gentle warmth of spring sunlight, the once raw scars of the Anderson family's nightmare began to soften. Months had passed since that storm-swept night when the world believed little Lila Anderson had been laid to rest. Months since Collins' empire of shadows collapsed under the weight of truth. Yet here in a quiet corner of the city, something new was being born. Something stitched together with love loss and an unyielding belief that healing was possible. The modest brick building stood at the edge of a park, its windows bright with the laughter of children. A simple sign above the door read, Winter's Hope Letters, painted in soft blue and white, a tribute to the four-legged guardian who had changed everything. The name carried weight not just for the Andersons, but for every family who had once thought hope was lost forever. Inside, the air hummed with gentle chaos. Children running through sunlit halls, volunteers guiding small hands with crayons, music floating from a nearby therapy room. It was a place built not of grandeur, but of heart. In a corner of the playroom, Lila sat cross-legged on a soft rug, a crayon clutched between her small fingers. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to copy the shape of a house from a coloring book. Beside her, Winter lay sprawled, his head resting on his paws, his steady eyes tracking every movement she made. Good job, sweetheart, Hannah whispered from the doorway, watching as Lila finally drew a crooked roof and beamed with pride. It was the first time in weeks Hannah had seen her daughter's smile reach all the way to her eyes. That smile was different now. It wasn't the bright, carefree grin Hannah remembered from before. Lila didn't remember the songs she once loved, the bedtime stories she'd begged for, or the way she used to run across the yard to leap into Michael's arms. But here in this moment, her smile felt like a promise she could still find joy. She could still be whole, even if in a new way. Winter's tail thumped softly against the floor as Lila giggled. She dropped the crayon and leaned forward to wrap her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The big dog didn't move, only let out a low, contented sigh. Michael appeared behind Hannah, carrying a stack of letters. His face was tired, but his eyes held a warmth Hannah hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. He touched her shoulder gently, pressing the envelopes into her hand. They came in this morning, he said softly. From the families. Hannah's throat tightened as she looked down at the thick stack. Some were typed, some handwritten with shaky scrawls, all carrying the same weight of gratitude. She sat at the edge of the window seat, tearing one envelope open with trembling fingers. The first letter was from a mother in Ohio whose son had vanished 2 years ago. Because of the evidence you brought forward, it read, we finally know the truth. We finally have him back. Thank you for saving us from a lifetime of not knowing. Tears blurred Hannah's vision as she read the next and the next. Parents thanking them for giving their children back. Children drawing pictures of dogs with shining eyes, words scrawled beneath, thank you, Winter. Hannah pressed her hand to her mouth. The sobs rising not from despair this time, but from something deeper. Pride, gratitude, the fragile beauty of knowing that their pain had not been in vain. Michael knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. You did this, he whispered. You and Winter. You gave them hope. Hannah shook her head, brushing a tear from her cheek. No, she whispered. Her gaze shifted to the playmat, where Winter now had his massive head resting in Lila's lap, her small hands absent-mindedly stroking his ears. He did. The camera lingered on Winter, as if he understood the weight of their words. His steady gaze lifted, locking with the lens unflinching, certain. In his eyes was no arrogance, no claim of glory, only a quiet, enduring strength. Children's laughter echoed in the background as the camera panned across the room. Bright murals painted by volunteers covered the walls, suns rising, forests filled with light, children holding hands with dogs that towered beside them. It wasn't just art. It was testament. Hannah set the letters down, walking slowly to her daughter. She knelt beside Lila, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "do you like it here?" Lila looked up, her eyes wide, innocent, unburdened by the memories that once defined her. She didn't know the weight her parents carried, didn't know the depth of the shadows they had fought to reach this day. She only knew the warmth in Winter's fur, the laughter of other children, the safety of her mother's voice. Her smile bloomed again, small but real. "Yes," she whispered. Hannah's heart broke and healed in the same instant. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering a vow against her skin. "We'll make this a place where no child ever feels alone again." As the sun dipped lower outside, painting the sky with gold and rose, Michael gathered the children in the main hall for the day's last activity. They sang softly, voices rising in a fragile harmony. Winter lay at the center of the circle, every child reaching out to touch him, as if his strength could spill into them too. Hannah stood back watching. Her eyes glistened, her chest full with something she hadn't dared to feel in so long. Hope. The final shot drew closer to Winter. He lifted his head, his ears pricking, and looked directly into the camera. His eyes burned steady, unyielding, filled with a wordless promise that transcended language. Love survives. Hope survives. The screen began to fade, music swelling, strings and piano weaving into a melody that carried both the ache of loss and the triumph of healing. The last frame lingered on Winter's gaze, then slowly faded to black. Words appeared on the screen. Winter's hope, a home for every child who needs one. And as the music swelled, the audience was left not with despair, but with the powerful, trembling truth that even in the face of memory-lost love could rebuild everything.